Hi there, my name's Eddie, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Wolfsbane Witch. And this is the first video on my channel that's entirely mine in concept, and honestly, it's a lot harder than I thought it'd be trying to figure out how to put it together and come up with ideas. I mean, you voted for it, but it still was kind of hard, and not gonna lie, I'm kind of nervous about this one because today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my personal practice, understanding of, and UPG of one of the most infamous entities in Norse mythology, Fenrir. What could possibly go wrong? Now, I'm gonna just give you a quick disclaimer. This is not a formal historical video on Norse mythology or Fenrir. I am going to mention briefly the story of Fenrir for context, but I'm kind of banking that you already understand a lot of these concepts in mythology before you watch this video. So if you're not quite familiar with the binding of Fenrir, I am going to talk about it, so you don't need to click off necessarily. But I definitely would recommend that you look a little bit more into it yourself after this if you're not familiar. So everything I'm going to be sharing from this point forward is mostly going to be about my personal interpretations of Fenrir as an openly queer, trans, eclectic pagan witch. And I think it's important to break down a little bit about my practice in order to kind of understand the lens that I'm looking at Fenrir from, and why the practice that I have allows me to work with a deity that wasn't necessarily considered a god or considered something worth veneration. Now, I'm gonna be real, the concept of an eclectic pagan or an eclectic witch can get complicated really fast. So, just for the term of this video, and to put my practice into context, I'm going to give you just a brief definition of an eclectic pagan, but definitely don't take this as gospel for all eclectic pagans. Generally, what an eclectic pagan is, though, is a pagan who takes one or more cultures or traditional practices or works with possibly multiple pantheons and combines them or syncretizes them into a practice that works for them and their personal tradition. And I mentioned that I'm a witch as well because my witchcraft also informs the lens that I work with deity or spirits through. And my personal witchcraft practice is very much inspired by chaos magic, although I wouldn't necessarily call myself a pure chaos magician by any means. I am quite inspired by a lot of the principles of chaos magic, and I do find them quite helpful in my practice. One of the most helpful ones that I find in my practice is the rejection of dogma. The rejection of dogma inherently makes you reevaluate things like absolute morality or absolute truth. And it helps you step back and learn how to dismantle your biases in order to look at things through all of their intricate shades of gray. And I find this to be a slightly more accurate way of looking at things. Surely we can never find the absolute truth in life, and I don't even think that exists, but we can get a little bit closer to it by analyzing things in less absolute terms. I also think that spirituality and witchcraft is inherently political because when you bring yourself into anything that you do, be it a hobby or especially spirituality or religion or any sort of practice like that, you're bringing your whole self into it. And that means you're bringing your context into it as well. So who you are, your socioeconomic status, how society treats you, all those things are things that can't be simply taken away or shed simply because you walk to your altar. I'm always trans, no matter where I am. And I have to admit that that does affect the way I interpret the world and see things around me. And therefore, that inherently affects the way that I view magic or spirits or anything else. I can't detach who I am from my spiritual practice because it's all connected. And so my practice is inherently political because, sadly, as a trans individual, my existence happens to be inherently political, whether I like it or not. And so, because of this, I don't necessarily fear or follow the stigmatization that comes with certain mythological beings like Loki or any of his sons like Fenrir or Jormungandr. I really just don't follow that sort of black and white line of good and bad or ultimate evil and ultimate good thinking. I find that a lot of metaphor or potentially powerful symbolism is stomped out when you do something like that, when you look at things through a through a moral purist sort of lens. It really devalues a lot of the lessons you could learn if you looked at things a little bit more fairly and a little bit less black and white. So, with all that being said, you might be wondering how this is translated into my actual practice. So, what I tend to work with is the Roman idea of a tutelary spirit, which can be defined as a spirit that is a protector or a guide of a person, a lineage, a geographic location, or an occupation, something in the physical world typically. If this sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you've heard the term patron or patron deity, and that's essentially the same concept. It comes from the Romans as well, and it's essentially the same thing, and I think that it's been absorbed into the occult community because it's actually a pretty helpful term. You see, even though the Norse didn't have patrons by that actual definition, the way that they tended to work with or worship deity was pretty similar to the Roman concept of a tutelary spirit. Oftentimes you would see people who were more agrarian in occupation worship a god like Freyr, who was often associated with the weather and agriculture and peace. And then you would have more militant or warrior class people worship Tyr, or Odin. And so it wasn't necessarily patrons or tutelary spirits by the Roman definition, but you can see how the behaviors sort of align, and how this concept of a patron has sort of trickled into the modern witchy vernacular. And so this might beg the question, what is it about Fenrir that draws me toward him, or draws him toward me as a tutelary spirit, a guiding spirit, a protecting spirit, a spirit that is linked to my position in society or my personal self? Well, in order to do that, let's dive into the story of the Binding of Fenrir, shall we? Long ago, during the time of the gods, trouble was brewing in Asgard. Or so it seemed. Loki, the famed god of mischief, and Angrboda, a giantess known as the bringer of sorrows, had just produced 3 children. Hel, a daughter, Jormungandr, a son, and their firstborn, Fenrir. Due to the parentage of these 3, there was quite a lot of controversy among the Aesir. Odin, chief of the gods, was worried that they would someday take over his position and surpass him in some way, bring some sort of calamity. And so he set off to find a wise woman who would give him the prophecy of the future of Loki's 3 children, and therefore help decide the fates of what he shall do with them. Upon receiving his prophecy, Odin set forth into his plan. He cast Jormungandr to the sea, gave the realm of Helheim to Hel, and for Fenrir, well, it was a bit more personal. For you see, it was Fenrir himself who was prophesied to bring the end of the king of the gods. Odin, of course, would not have this, and hence set forth to create a plan to bind Fenrir away for forever and leave him to rot, allowing Odin to continue his reign over the gods for forevermore. Fenrir, or Fenrisulf, was often depicted as the form of a wolf. He was said to have been brought to Asgard to be raised, and while he was a puppy, he was quite loved by the members of the Aesir, including, and most notably, the god Tyr, the god of justice, honor, and law. However, this was no simple wolf puppy, for Fenrir would soon grow larger and larger and larger than any other wolf his age or of natural size. And due to the prophecy and the stigma behind his parentage, soon many of the Aesir gods started to fear him, and would no longer play with him or feed him, all except the bravest of them, Tyr. Upon gaining the knowledge of Odin's prophecy, the gods aided him in enacting a plan. They would stage a game, a test of strength of sorts, in which they would put different bindings upon Fenrir and urge him to break it, claiming that each time he surpassed his bindings, which would gradually get more and more tough to break, he would become more and more famous and well-renowned. And so Fenrir agreed to this game. The first binding that the gods put on him, he broke with ease. The second one, which was half more strong than the first one, he also broke, although with a little bit less ease. After this, however, the gods knew that they couldn't bind Fenrir once more without employing some sort of magic, and so they took to the dwarves, who would construct the chains of Gleipnir. These chains were created by arcane ingredients, and therefore would make it quite hard for Fenrir to break them. Although the chains were nearly unbreakable, they appeared as fine as silk, and so when presented with them, in the case of his newest test of strength, the clever Fenrir knew that they must have been constructed with some sort of sorcery or trickery in mind, and therefore denied this game, as he thought it would be unfair or rigged. The gods continued to try to convince Fenrir to put on the chains of Gleipnir, and in doing so he stipulated that one of the gods offered to put their hand in his mouth in a test of good faith. Many of them refused and stumbled for a while until the bravest of them and friend of Fenrir, Tyr, stepped up and placed his hand in the maw of the wolf. But of course, upon being unable to free himself from the chains, he bit off the hand of his only friend. It was said that during this time, all the gods began to laugh at Fenrir as he struggled, and as the chains of Gleipnir grew tighter, and as the blood flowed from the bleeding hand of Tyr. All laughed, except for Tyr. As Fenrir began to struggle more and more, he realized that the chains were getting tighter, and he snapped his jaws at the mocking gods, who silenced him by shoving a sword into his mouth, propping it open, and silencing him. From his gaping maw flowed rivers, and there he would sit until the beginning of Ragnarok, where his chains would be broken, and he would seize Odin and devour him until his death at the hands of Vidar, god of vengeance. And this is the story of Fenrir, a story that has been villainized and demonized throughout antiquity. Isn't it telling how, even now, Fenrir is still demonized and villainized? I don't find it to be a coincidence, personally. I mean, we live in a colonialist, supremacist society, a culture that inherently thrives on the stigmatization and oppression of others. It thrives off of punishing others for their perceived identity that might threaten the current status quo. So, in a way, Fenrir during Ragnarok kind of symbolizes a falling sword of Damocles brought about by the betrayal of justice. And just like King Dionysius in this example, Odin brought about this sword of Damocles, this inevitable fall of violence, based on his own greed, cruelty, and misuse of his relationship and control over justice. From a queer perspective, Fenrir's story can be a story of oppression, the dangers of prejudice, of governmental structural failure, and, of course, of reclaiming justice and freedom. It's a warning to leaders to be wary about trusting inclinations based on half-guided information and prejudice. But it also can serve as a tool for those who have been oppressed to learn how to harness the chaotic powers of revolution to make meaningful and long-lasting change. One of the things that kind of brings me to this point is something that I think is often overlooked. And I think all of Fenrir's story is often overlooked or misshapen into something that it isn't, but this is something that I'd like to talk a little bit more about for this part of the video. I'd like to highlight the fact that many gods helped traumatize or bind Fenrir, and many more were completely complacent in his freedom. But when he escaped during the beginning of Ragnarok, he didn't rampage and kill all of them in bloodthirsty revenge. He instead specifically went after Odin. And I believe that this is often misunderstood as an act of personal vengeance. But I'd like to try to recontextualize that and put it into a different perspective. Since I've already shared with you the brief story of Fenrir, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I'd like to pick apart certain aspects of the story to help better understand and explain my point. So I think we can all agree that the three main characters that are typically focused on within the story of the Binding of Fenrir are Odin, Tyr, and Fenrir. So let's break down those characters or archetypes or entities, deities, and explain what they might mean symbolically. For this, I'm going to suggest that Odin might represent leadership, kings, the authority of government. Tyr represents justice and honor, and Fenrir represents the oppressed. Now, when we put Odin into context as a leader or as a king god, that kind of explains a little bit about what happens after the Binding of Fenrir. Because as we know, Tyr was a friend of Fenrir, and Tyr is the god of justice, so why doesn't he free Fenrir? Well, when it comes to kings, especially in pre-Christian times, and even during Christian times, there was this sort of divine rule thing going on, where kings and leaders had authority over law and governance, and therefore the enactment of and the use of justice. This is still kind of how governmental systems and powers work. And it is to be heavily, heavily noted that being an oath breaker in Norse culture was a very, very shameful and dishonorable thing. And so when Fenrir noticed that the bindings must have been made with sorcery or trickery, and therefore had the stipulation of making an oath to put a hand in his mouth, that might be why all of the other gods hesitated, because they knew that they would be breaking an oath. They would be willingly putting themselves in a dishonorable position. Tyr, however, did it out of his sense of honor and justice, because as far as he knew from Odin, it was for the greater good. But of course, as we learn in the end, it wasn't for the greater good. No greater good came from the binding of Fenrir, and so I'd like to highlight the fact that if it wasn't for Odin's paranoia about his own death, his greed and wanting to maintain his future for forever, and of course his misuse of his relationship and authority over Tyr, Justice, then Justice would have never suffered injury. His hand would have never been bitten. He would have never had been put in a place to be an oathbreaker. Tyr would have never been dishonored had Odin not bound Fenrir. And so I suggest the idea that maybe Fenrir, at the end of Ragnarok, is not simply killing Odin out of personal satisfaction and revenge, but as an act of ultimate payback for making his only friend, the embodiment of justice and honor itself, into an oathbreaker, into something dishonest. Fenrir, after all, is not the embodiment of vengeance. In fact, he's killed by the embodiment of vengeance, Vidar, Odin's son, by being stabbed through the heart and having his jaw broken apart. We can take this to mean that acts of vengeance are antithetical to the spirit and heart and core of revolution. It can silence and tear it apart and leave it biteless and howlless, barkless, silent once more. Because revolution is not an act of vengeance. It's an act of restoration of justice and honor that was not rightfully used or served. And it can be said that any modern activist's goal is to catalyst change that will right the wrongs of the people in power who have misused and dishonored justice. And it can be really hard for people outside of or uneducated about marginalized groups to really understand this type of activism, especially when it's paired with the weaponized media that we have. It's a breeding ground for misinformation, for demonization, and for further separation of people. And I think it's because actions taken by activists can look a lot like vengeance. And that's because it specifically targets the status quo and those who work actively to uphold it. And the harder those people fight to uphold the status quo, the harder and more extreme activists will have to fight, and the more intense it'll be in order to get the change that they need. And this can build up and create a lot of conflicting interactions when it comes to activism or acts of protest. And it can look very violent and vengeful and scary. And I think in a way it's because we are a threat. The existence of anyone outside of the norm who wants to regain a sense of self and a sense of equality throughout all of that is inherently going to have to challenge a lot of the capitalist and colonialist systems that run our countries and make our politicians rich. And that in itself is going to have to destroy a lot of things. It's going to mean that we have to change life as we know it in order to shape something for a brighter future. A Ragnarok must ensue, so that way a new day can be born. As a trans man who has faced violence and discrimination based purely on his identity alone, the story of Fenrir is one that I can relate to in a way that I rarely get to share with other entities or deities. Rarely do I get to see this sort of pain and kinship that I felt with Fenrir in other entities in any sort of mythology. I feel like Fenrir knows me. And although his story is not necessarily a happy one, I think that's okay. I think sometimes it's helpful to share and explore the darkness that we feel, because when we do that, we often find that we're not standing in it alone. Darkness can be a place of great sorrow, but like Fenrir within his bindings, it can also be a place of great growth. The world is not a safe or a fair place to be. There's always going to be darkness and periods of inevitable collapse that are going to leave you feeling hopeless and scared. But as long as we take the opportunities we can to devour that which flies in the face and dishonors justice, we can die knowing that we made a change, that we made a difference, into bringing a new light, into bringing a new day into being. Fenrir doesn't get to see the new light, the new sun that's born at the end of Ragnarok, but he brings it forward nonetheless. And that's kind of how Fenrir became a patron of mine. It's a kind of weird way to introduce myself into this YouTube thing, but hey, you voted for it, and the next video I'm going to make is probably going to be the one on problematic mythology and how I deal with that. It's going to go a little bit more into my personal unpacking of and process of working with spirits that might have problematic elements to them, kind of like Fenrir. So you might like that video. This is kind of the end of the video, but before I go, I want to share something very, very, very important, so please stick around just a little bit longer. So before I go, I just want to mention that all of the footage that you saw in this video of real wolves was taken at Wolf Mountain Nature Center in Smyrna, New York. This is a place that's local to where I grew up, and it has a very special place in my heart. It's a volunteer and donation-run conservation center for wolves, coyotes, and Arctic foxes. Wolf Mountain Nature Center was created by a community member and friend of mine, Will Pryor. Will is a Native American biologist, conservationalist, and environmentalist. He also used to be a substitute teacher, which is how I grew to know him. Will has spent the last several decades of his life dedicating it to conservation, to educating the public about wolves, and some of the things that have led to the decline of their numbers in the wild. Just like with Fenrir or oppressed individuals, wolves have also had a very unfortunate history of being stigmatized and demonized, much to the detriment of their existence in the wild. It can be said that folklore and myths like the binding and demonization of Fenrir have helped play a role in creating these types of myths that have perpetuated harm towards these animals that are now endangered in several areas across the world. I'll let Will tell you a little bit more about some of these misconceptions.
Other myths are that they dig up dead bodies in graveyards. They kill everything that they possibly can. They eat all the sheep and goats on the farms and kill all the calves and pretty much make a great nuisance of themselves. People came here to North America from other parts of the world. They brought with them this idea that the wolf was evil, that the wolf was even sent by the devil, and it was an evil thing that needed to be gotten rid of. And the people who lived here for thousands of years, the Native American people, never saw the wolf that way. They saw the wolf in a very different way, and that is as a teacher. People observed the wolves for a long time, and they learned from watching them that they're very much like us. And they taught us many things, like how to hunt, how to raise our children, how to defend our villages, and also how to enjoy life.
If you'd like to donate to Wolf Mountain Nature Center, I'm going to be leaving links to their donation section of the website below, but definitely check out their merch section also. They sell a lot of really cool things, and also, if you ask, they will sell you ethically sourced wolf fur that they get from just like brushing the wolves when they shed. So if you want to use wolf fur, like actual wolf fur in your spells, you can buy it from them, and it all goes to helping maintain the wolves and helping for community outreach and stuff like that. So it's really cool and also a sick spell ingredient. So you could pick something like that up. But of course, donations also start at only $5. So if you don't have a lot but just want to spare a little bit in the name of Fenrir, go ahead and do that. I know I'll be doing that. And with that, I bid you farewell. I hope you liked this video, and thank you so much for watching if you watched this far. It's probably been a little bit longer of a video, maybe a little controversial, I don't know. We'll see. I'll see you in the next one, and have a nice day.